Somewhere on a crowded newsstand in the late spring of 1938, tucked among the pulp magazines and the 10-cent adventures, there sat a thin little comic book with a startling picture on its cover. A man in a red cape lifting an automobile clean over his head while frightened onlookers scattered, and almost no one buying it that day could have known that they were looking at the first small spark of an entire modern mythology. From that single strange image, and the handful of others that came soon after it, would grow one of the two great houses of the comic book world, a vast and sprawling universe of caped wonders and shadowed avengers and whole invented cosmologies. And tonight, gently and slowly, we are going to wander through the long and tangled history of it, of the company and the characters we now know simply by two quiet letters, one soft and unhurried fact at a time. So settle in and make yourself comfortable. Let the worries of the day loosen and slip away, and allow your breathing to slow and your eyes to grow heavy, because for the next little while you have nothing at all to do but lie still in the warm dark and listen. If a slow, quiet drift through the history of this great paper universe is the kind of thing that helps you let go and fall asleep, you might leave a gentle like before you go, and perhaps tell me down in the comments where in the world you are listening from tonight, and then simply release it all and let me carry you softly through more than 200 small facts about the heroes and the villains and the dreamers who built them, one calm whisper at a time, until sleep comes at last to gather you in. The company itself is older than any of its famous heroes, and its beginnings were humble and a little chaotic, the work of a colourful former cavalry officer who founded a small publishing outfit in the middle of the 1930s to put out cheap anthology comics full of short adventure tales. One of the early titles he launched was a book devoted to detective and mystery stories, and its plain, descriptive name, Detective Comics, would end up echoing down through the decades in a way no one intended, for it is from those two words and the initials they gave that the whole company would eventually take the short name the world now knows it by, a great empire of the imagination, quietly named after a modest little mystery anthology from a vanished age. The founder did not last long at the head of his own company, undone by the money troubles that plagued so many small publishers of that scrappy era, and control passed to the businessmen who had backed him, who folded his imprint together with their own and set about building something larger. It was under their watch, and largely at the urging of an editor with a good eye, that the company took the gamble that would change everything, buying a strange and much rejected idea from two young men from the middle of the country and printing it in a brand new anthology title, an idea that had been turned away by nearly everyone in the business as too outlandish to sell. That idea, of course, was A Man from Another World, and the anthology was the one with the red-caped figure on its cover, and nothing in the industry would ever be the same again. That new title, built around action and adventure, sold in numbers that astonished everyone, and it slowly became clear that it was the strange caped strongman driving those sales, that readers were coming back again and again for him and him alone. The company, sensing what it had stumbled into, gave the character his own dedicated book within a couple of years, and began, cautiously at first and then eagerly, to fill its pages with others like him, a whole new kind of hero. And in doing so, it did not merely publish a successful character, but effectively invented an entire genre, the costumed champion with fantastic powers, which would go on to become one of the most popular forms of storytelling of the entire century. It all traces back to that one gamble, that one rejected idea finally given a chance. The man who started it all was dreamed up by two teenagers from Cleveland, a shy writer and a nearsighted artist, two sons of immigrant families who met in high school and bonded over a shared love of the pulp science fiction magazines of the day. Over several years and several very different early versions, including one in which their creation was a bald villain bent on conquering the world, they slowly refined the idea into the hopeful figure we know, a strange visitor from another planet who would use his fantastic abilities to help the helpless. They shopped the concept around the industry for years and were rejected again and again, told it was too far-fetched, too silly, until at last it found a home in that new anthology title and exploded into a success beyond anything anyone had imagined. The story of what happened to those two young men afterward is one of the great sorrows of the whole industry, and it is worth telling gently, because it sits beneath all the bright heroism like a quiet ache. Desperate to see their creation in print, they had signed away the rights to him for a modest sum, a little over $100 split between them, in exchange for the deal to publish the first story. That signature meant that as their character went on to earn untold fortunes, to sell millions of comics, and spawn radio shows and films, and an ocean of merchandise, the two men who had dreamed him up received almost none of it, and were eventually pushed out altogether, spending much of their lives in financial hardship, while the thing they made conquered the world. The character they lost was built from a wonderful tangle of ideas, a being born on a distant planet that was doomed to destruction, sent to safety as an infant in a small rocket by his desperate parents in the last moments before their world tore itself apart. He came to rest in the fields of the American heartland, was found and raised by a kindly farming couple who gave him their values along with their name, and grew up to hide his incredible nature behind the disguise of a mild and bespectacled newspaperman in a great gleaming city. It is, when you step back from it, a beautiful and deeply resonant myth, an immigrant story and an orphan story, and a story about choosing to be good, and it struck a chord so deep that it has never stopped ringing. His powers, curiously, were far more modest at the very beginning than they would later become, for in his earliest adventures he could not truly fly at all, but only leap enormous distances, bounding over tall buildings in a single spring, and he was strong and fast and hard to hurt, but not the nearly limitless being he grew into. Over the years, as writers pushed to keep him exciting, his abilities swelled and multiplied. The leaping became true flight, the strength grew until he could move worlds, and new powers appeared as they were needed. Vision that could see through walls or melt steel, breath that could freeze, until he became less a strongman than a kind of modern god, so powerful that his writers have struggled ever since to find things that could genuinely threaten him. The one thing that could threaten him, famously, is a glowing fragment of his own destroyed homeworld, a radioactive mineral deadly to him alone, and there is a lovely piece of history in where that idea came from, for it was not invented in the comics at all, but on the radio. The wildly popular radio show built around the character needed a way to give its lead voice actor an occasional rest, some plot device that could lay the hero low and let another performer carry an episode while he groaned quietly in the background. And so the writers invented the glowing stone that saps his strength. It worked so well that it migrated back into the comics and became one of the most famous weaknesses in all of fiction. A whole spectrum of colored stones dreamed up over the years, all born from a radio show's simple need to give an actor a holiday. That same radio show, it turns out, gave the mythology a surprising number of the pieces we now think of as essential, quietly inventing them on the air before they ever reached the page. It was there that the hero gained his loyal young photographer friend, there that certain of his most famous phrases were first spoken, There that the great newspaper where he worked took clearer shape, and there, in a memorable later crossover, that he first crossed paths on the airwaves with the caped detective from the company's other flagship title. The spoken word, drifting out of countless living room radios in the 1940s, did as much to build the legend as the ink ever did, a reminder of how many hands and how many media it took to raise a single modern myth. The success of the caped strongman sent the company scrambling to create more heroes, and the very next year it struck gold a second time, with a figure who was, in almost every way, the first one's opposite. Where the first hero was bright and hopeful and nearly invulnerable, an alien who worked in the sunlight, the second was dark and grim and entirely human, a mortal man driven by grief, who worked in the shadows and inspired fear rather than hope. He was a wealthy orphan who had watched his parents murdered as a child and had sworn to wage a lifelong war on crime, dressing himself as a bat to strike terror into the superstitious hearts of criminals. And though his origins are simpler and sadder than the aliens, he would grow to become perhaps the single most popular character the company ever produced, proof that a hero needs no powers at all, only a will that will not break. The credit for that dark detective, like the credit for so many early creations, has its own quiet injustice, for he was long attributed to a single artist, while much of what made him essential, his name, his city, his greatest foes, the very shape of his cowl and cape, came from a co-creator, a quiet writer who went unrecognized for the better part of a century before the record was finally, belatedly set straight. It is a pattern that repeats across these early years with a sad regularity. The young dreamers who built an empire and were written out of it, and it is worth remembering, amid all the wonder, how many of these bright legends rest on the uncredited labor of people who were quietly left behind. The third of what would come to be called the Great Trinity arrived a couple of years later, and she was something genuinely new, a heroine to stand equal beside the men, created by a most unusual man with a most unusual purpose. He was a psychologist, a Harvard-trained academic, who had helped develop an early version of the lie detector, measuring the way a person's blood pressure rises when they deceive. And it is no accident at all that the heroine he dreamed up carries a golden lasso that forces anyone bound by it to tell the truth. He believed, quite earnestly, that the world was in trouble because it was ruled by the aggressive impulses of men, and that it needed the example of a loving, powerful woman to show a better way. And so he set out, quite deliberately, to create a feminist hero wrapped in the costume of an adventure comic. The heroine he made was a princess of a hidden race of immortal warrior women, living apart from the world of men on a secret paradise island. And in her classic origin, she was not born at all, but sculpted from clay by her mother and given life and gifts by the gods, so that she is in a sense a wish made flesh, a daughter longed for and shaped by loving hands. She came into the world of men as an ambassador and a warrior both, armed with her lasso of truth and her indestructible bracelets and a tiara she could throw like a blade, and she carried into the bright, punch-throwing world of the early comics a strange and genuine idealism, a belief in compassion and truth and peace that set her apart from nearly everyone around her. Her creator was as unconventional in his life as in his art, living in a household with two women, his wife and their shared partner, both of whom were remarkable and accomplished people in their own right, and both of whom are widely believed to have helped inspire the heroine they lived alongside. His stories were also full of imagery of chains and bonds and breaking free of them, deliberate on his part, tied up in his own peculiar philosophy about submission and strength, and it made the early adventures of the heroine stranger and more personal than almost anything else the company was printing. She has gone on to become one of the most recognized and beloved characters in the world, an enduring symbol far larger than the odd and earnest man who made her, but the fingerprints of his strange idealism are on her still. There is a small, telling detail from those early team-up days that captures how far the world has traveled since. For when the heroine first joined the company's earliest gathering of assembled heroes, a club of costumed champions banded together, she was made, in an unfortunate sign of the times, the group's secretary, left to mind the headquarters while the men went off to have the adventures. It is a jarring thing to read now, the mightiest warrior in the room reduced to taking the minutes, and it stands as a quiet marker of the long distance the character and the culture around her would have to travel before she was allowed to take her rightful place as an equal among the greatest heroes of them all. The years that followed those first great successes are remembered now as the Golden Age, a wild and fertile time when it seemed that every month brought a new costumed champion onto the newsstands, as the company and its rivals raced to fill the appetite that the caped strongman had revealed. Out of that flood came a whole first generation of heroes, many of whom are still with us in one form or another, each one a bright and simple idea given a costume and a catchphrase. There was a man who gained the power of super speed and raced across the pages in a gleaming winged helmet. There was a man who found a mysterious lantern and forged from it a ring that could make his will take shape as green light. There were winged men and shrinking men and ghostly avengers, a riot of invention pouring out month after month. Someone had the clever idea, early on, of gathering a handful of these separate heroes together into a single team, and so was born the first assembled group of costume champions in the whole history of the medium, a club whose members would meet and share adventures and then go their separate ways. It seems an obvious notion now, so familiar that we forget it had to be invented, but at the time it was a small revolution, the discovery that heroes, who each sold their own comics, could be brought together into something larger, and that readers would delight in seeing their favorites stand shoulder to shoulder. That first team laid the groundwork for one of the most enduring and profitable ideas the company would ever have, the super team, which it would return to again and again down the decades. The early heroes were often stranger and rougher than their later versions, their powers explained by wonderfully odd bits of pseudoscience, their weaknesses peculiar and specific. The first speedster was said to have gained his gift by breathing the fumes of a strange heavy water. The first man of the Green Ring found that for all its power, it was useless against anything made of wood, a curiously homely vulnerability for so cosmic a weapon. These early quirks would mostly be smoothed away in later years, but there is a real charm in them, in the sheer make-it-up-as-you-go inventiveness of those first creators, dreaming up powers and origins at a furious pace to feed the hungry newsstands, never imagining that their throwaway ideas would still be argued over nearly a century later. The Golden Age burned bright but not forever, and it was the Great World War that first lifted the heroes to their dizziest heights, for they threw themselves into the war effort on the page, battling enemy agents and selling war bonds, and standing as bright symbols of the cause, and sales soared as soldiers and children alike devoured them by the millions. But when the war ended, the appetite for costumed heroes cooled almost as quickly as it had risen, and through the late 1940s and into the 50s, title after title was cancelled as readers drifted toward other kinds of stories, and the great flood slowed to a trickle. The team disbanded, the lesser heroes vanished, and of all that bright early crowd, only a small handful, the Alien, the Bat, and the Amazon Chief among them, kept their own books running continuously through the lean years. The industry turned, in that fallow time, to other genres entirely, filling its pages with romance and westerns and crime and science fiction and tales of horror, chasing whatever readers still wanted. And for a while, it seemed that the age of the costumed hero might simply have been a passing fad of the war years, a bright bubble that had burst. And then came the great moral panic of the middle 1950s, when a crusading psychiatrist and a frightened public turned on comics altogether, blaming them for the troubles of the young, and the industry, terrified, bound itself in a strict code of self-censorship that scrubbed the pages clean of anything frightening or subversive. The horror and crime comics that had thrived were gutted, and in the strange quiet that followed, the stage was quietly set for the costumed hero of all things to make his return. The return of the costumed hero, when it came in the middle of the 1950s, was the work of a thoughtful editor with a background in science fiction, who decided to take one of the company's faded old heroes and reinvent him from the ground up for a new generation. He kept the basic idea, a man with the power of super speed, but threw out nearly everything else, giving him a new name, a new identity, a sleek new red costume, and crucially, a new origin, rooted not in strange fumes, but in the language of science, a laboratory accident involving lightning and chemicals that rewrote the hero for an age that had fallen in love with rockets and atoms. The reinvented speedster was an instant success, and his arrival is generally taken to mark the beginning of a whole new era, the Silver Age, in which the heroes came roaring back. Emboldened by that success, the company went down its roster of forgotten Golden Age heroes and reinvented them one by one in the same spirit, remaking the Man of the Green Ring as a fearless test pilot chosen by dying aliens to join an intergalactic police force, remaking hero after hero with fresh origins and a shiny new scientific gloss. And then, in a move that echoed the Golden Age but on a grander scale, it gathered these newly minted heroes together, along with the Alien and the Bat and the Amazon, into a new and mightier team, a league of the world's greatest champions banded together to face threats too large for any one of them alone. That team became one of the most successful and important properties the company ever created, and its very existence would soon have consequences that rippled out across the entire industry. The reinvented heroes raised a curious and delightful problem, for the older versions of them had never actually gone away in the minds of longtime readers, and the question naturally arose of how the new speedster and the old speedster could both exist. The answer the company arrived at was one of the most consequential ideas in all of comics, the notion that the old heroes lived on a separate parallel Earth, a second world vibrating at a different frequency alongside the first, and that on rare and special occasions a hero might cross the barrier between them and meet his own predecessor. That single story, in which the new speedster vibrates his way across to the world of the old one, quietly invented the comic book multiverse, an infinite stack of parallel Earths, and it opened a door that the company would spend the next 60 years and more walking through. The multiverse was a gift and a burden both, for it allowed endless creativity, whole worlds where history had gone differently, evil versions of the heroes, Earths where the heroes had aged or never existed, but it also grew, over the years, into a tangled and intimidating thicket that new readers found nearly impossible to follow. Numbered Earths accumulated, continuities contradicted one another, and the sheer weight of decades of history began to feel less like a rich mythology and more like a locked door, and the company would eventually feel driven to take drastic action to simplify it all. a recurring cycle of tidying up that became a strange tradition unto itself. But all of that lay in the future. In the bright optimism of the Silver Age, the multiverse was simply a wondrous new playground, infinite and shining. The Silver Age had a particular flavor all its own, sunny and imaginative and a little bit silly, full of bright colors and cosmic wonders and gloriously strange ideas, shaped in part by the restrictions of the censorship code, which pushed writers away from anything dark and toward the fantastical and the whimsical. It was an age of alien worlds and impossible transformations, of heroes turning into unlikely shapes and visiting the far future and puzzling out clever science fiction riddles. And while later generations would sometimes smile at its innocence, there is a genuine joy in the comics of that era, an untroubled delight in pure imagination. The heroes of the Silver Age were rebuilt to be reassuring and wondrous, and they carried the company back to the top of the industry it had helped to invent. Around the Great Trinity and the reinvented Speedster and Ringbearer gathered a whole wider pantheon, dozens of heroes who filled out the universe and gave it depth, and each of them carries a store of quiet facts worth drifting through. There is the last survivor of a dead Mars, a green-skinned shapeshifter and telepath who was pulled to Earth by a scientist's experiment and stranded here, taking on a human disguise and becoming, over time, one of the most beloved and quietly melancholy members of the great team, a gentle soul mourning a lost world and a lost family, with a strange and endearing weakness to fire and a well-known fondness for a particular brand of sandwich cookie. He is often called the heart of the team, the lonely alien who understands better than anyone what it means to be far from home. There is the King of the Sea, ruler of a sunken ancient kingdom beneath the waves, able to command the creatures of the deep and to survive the crushing dark of the ocean floor, a hero long unfairly mocked as the least impressive of the great champions, and yet, in the better stories, one of the most formidable of them all, a monarch caught forever between two worlds, belonging fully to neither the land nor the sea. There is the Emerald Archer, a wealthy man turned crusader who fights with a bow and a quiver of trick arrows, and who grew, over the years, into the great social conscience of the universe, the hero most likely to argue about politics and to champion the poor and the forgotten, his stories often turning to the troubles of the real world in a way few others dared. There is the woman with the sonic scream, whose cry can shatter stone, a legacy heroine, carrying on the name and the mission of her mother before her. There are the winged warriors, whose story stretches back across the centuries, reincarnated again and again through the ages, drawn together and torn apart and reborn to find each other once more, their wings made of a strange anti-gravity metal fallen from the stars. There is the tiny Titan, a physicist who learned to shrink himself down to the size of an atom and smaller, walking through the hidden worlds within worlds. Each of them added a new color to the palette, a new corner to explore, until the universe had grown into a genuinely vast and varied place, thick with heroes and their histories. There is the sorceress who works her magic by speaking her spells backwards, the daughter of a stage magician who was himself a hero, a figure who bridges the bright world of the costume champions and the darker, stranger world of the mystical and the supernatural that runs alongside it. For the universe was never only science and strength. It had always had a shadowed occult side too, a realm of ghosts and demons and ancient powers, of a spectral avenger who is the very wrath of heaven given form, of helmeted sorcerers and haunted houses, and this hidden magical world would grow, over the decades, into one of the richest and most atmospheric corners of the whole mythology, a place where the rules of the bright heroes did not quite apply. Far in the future, meanwhile, the company built one of its most sprawling and beloved corners of all, a club of teenage heroes living 1,000 years ahead, inspired by the legend of the ancient caped strongman of their history, gathered from 100 different worlds and each blessed with a single strange power. This future team grew into an enormous and intricate world of its own, with dozens upon dozens of members and a devoted following who cherished its tangled friendships and romances and losses, a whole optimistic vision of a united galaxy far ahead in time, still keeping faith with the ideals a single hero had planted 1,000 years before. That a legend could reach forward across 10 centuries to inspire the young heroes of a distant age is one of the loveliest ideas the universe ever produced. One of the most fascinating heroes in the whole stable did not begin at the company at all, but was born at a rival publisher and only came home to the universe decades later, after a strange and tangled history. He was a young boy who, by speaking a single magic word, could transform in a flash of lightning into a mighty adult hero. The word itself an acronym drawn from 6 gods and heroes of the ancient world, each lending him a piece of their power, the wisdom of one and the strength of another and the speed of a third. In his heyday in the 1940s, he was astonishingly popular, so popular that he actually outsold the original caped strongman for a time, a boy's wish-fulfillment fantasy so pure and so joyful that readers could not get enough of him. His very success, though, led to his downfall, for the company that owned the caped strongman took a hard look at this red-suited flying hero with his cape and his great strength, and decided he was rather too similar to their own creation, and sued the rival publisher for copyright infringement in a legal battle that dragged on for years. In the end, the rival, worn down by the fight and by the fading fortunes of superheroes in the post-war slump, chose to settle and simply stopped publishing the character altogether, and the once mighty hero vanished from the newsstands for the better part of 2 decades, a casualty of the very success that had made him a threat. It is one of the stranger tales in the industry, a hero effectively litigated out of existence by the company that would one day own him. For decades later, when superheroes were thriving again, the company that had once sued him instead licensed and eventually purchased the very character it had driven from the shelves, welcoming the lightning-powered hero into its own universe at last. But time had played a cruel little trick, for in the years he had been gone, the other great comics company, the company's chief rival, had claimed his old name for a hero of their own and trademarked it, meaning that the returning hero could no longer be published under the title he had made famous. And so, in a quiet irony, the character can appear and adventure freely, but the book that bears him must be called by the magic word he speaks, rather than by his own old name, a permanent little scar left by all those years of legal wrangling, visible to anyone who knows where to look. Around that same era, the company received a jolt of pure creative lightning from a single extraordinary artist, one of the most important and imaginative creators the entire medium has ever known, who came over from the rival company where he had helped build its whole line and arrived hungry to create something vast and new. What he made was a sprawling cosmic mythology of warring gods, a saga of 2 worlds, one a shining paradise, and the other a hellish planet of fire and tyranny, and of the eternal war between them, populated by strange and grand new deities he dreamed up at a furious pace. It was ambitious almost beyond the medium's ability to contain it, a genuine attempt at a modern mythology, and though it was cut short before he could finish telling it, The ideas he planted in those few years would grow into some of the most important elements of the entire universe. Chief among those ideas was a villain who would become the universe's single greatest and most terrifying antagonist, a grim, stone-faced god of tyranny who rules the planet of fire and hungers for a cosmic equation that, once solved, would let him snuff out all free will in the universe and bend every living mind to his own. He is less a supervillain than a dark god, patient and vast and almost geological in his menace, and he has loomed over the heroes ever since as the ultimate threat, the shadow at the edge of every bright story, the one enemy whose victory would mean not merely death, but the end of freedom itself. That so cosmic and enduring a figure came from the restless imagination of a single artist in just a few short years is a testament to how much one dreamer can pour into a universe. A universe of great heroes needs great villains, and the company assembled a rogues gallery every bit as rich as its pantheon of champions, each hero shadowed by an enemy who is, in some way, his dark reflection. The caped strongman's greatest foe is not a monster or a rival alien, but simply a man, a human being of towering intellect and even more towering ego, a brilliant scientist and businessman, consumed by a jealousy so deep it has swallowed his whole life. He cannot forgive the alien for being what he himself, for all his genius, can never be. And he has spent his existence trying to prove that humanity needs no savior from the stars. A villain who believes himself the hero of his own story, which makes him far more unsettling than any raving madman. There is a small piece of history in his famous baldness, which is said to have begun as an art error early on, a hero drawn without his hair, and which simply stuck until it became iconic. The strongman is haunted too by a green-skinned menace from the far reaches of space, a cold and calculating intelligence that travels the cosmos collecting cities, shrinking whole metropolises down to the size of a bottle and preserving them in miniature aboard his ship, and who once stole and bottled a surviving city of the hero's own dead homeworld, a last fragment of a lost people kept prisoner in glass. There is something genuinely eerie in that image, a whole living city shrunk and sealed away on a shelf, and it captures the particular horror of that villain, a being who reduces the living to specimens, who sees civilizations as things to be catalogued and owned, curiosity utterly divorced from mercy. The other heroes have their own dark mirrors, and the pattern of reflection runs all through the gallery. The man of the green ring is opposed by his own former mentor, once the greatest of the ring bearers, who fell to the belief that order must be imposed through fear rather than courage, and who wields a ring of sickly yellow light drawn from terror itself. The speedster is hunted across time by a twisted admirer from the future, a fellow runner who loves and hates him in equal obsessive measure, and who reaches back through the years to unravel his life at its very roots. The lightning-powered hero is shadowed by a corrupted ancient champion who wielded the same magic long before him and was ruined by it. Again and again, the greatest enemy is not the hero's opposite, but his echo, the same gifts turned a darker way. The gallery holds stranger and more colourful menaces too, for not every villain is a tragic reflection. Some are simply wonderful, strange ideas given room to run. There is a super-intelligent gorilla with the power to command minds, ruler of a hidden city of brilliant apes. There is a whole troupe of themed criminals who plague the speedster, a man of cold and a man of mirrors and a man of tricks, rogues who bicker and scheme and follow their own peculiar code of honor, and who are, oddly, among the most beloved villains in the whole universe, precisely because they feel less like monsters than like a dysfunctional, colorful family. The universe always understood that its villains needed personality as much as menace, that a rogues gallery is a kind of ensemble, and it built some of the finest in all of fiction. Inevitably, the villains too were gathered into teams, mirroring the great alliances of the heroes, banding together in secret societies and legions of the wicked to pool their strength against the champions who kept defeating them one by one. There is a certain delicious logic to it, the notion that if the heroes are stronger together, then so too are their enemies, and the great villain team-ups became beloved fixtures, whole rosters of the universe's worst assembled around a shadowed table to plot the downfall of the light. Presiding over all of them, at the very summit of the universe's darkness, sits the grim god of tyranny from the burning world, the ultimate enemy toward whom all the lesser villains are, in a sense, only rehearsal, the shadow that gives the whole bright pantheon its weight and its stakes. By the middle of the 1980s, the multiverse that had seemed such a gift had grown into a genuine problem. Decades of accumulated history stacked into an unwieldy tower of parallel Earths and contradictory continuities that longtime readers loved, but newcomers found utterly impenetrable. And so the company did something audacious and, at the time, almost unthinkable, publishing a vast, universe-spanning epic whose entire purpose was to tear the whole tangled structure down and rebuild it clean. A sprawling war across all the parallel Earths that ended with those countless worlds collapsed and merged into a single, tidy universe with a single history. Beloved characters died in that great reckoning. Whole Earths were erased, and the company emerged on the other side, simplified and streamlined, its slate wiped, ready to begin again. That great house cleaning was meant to be a once-in-a-lifetime event, a final solution to the problem of too much history, and yet it turned out to be only the first of many, for the tidying never quite held. New complications accumulated, new contradictions crept in, and every decade or so the company would feel driven to publish another reality-shaking epic to patch or reset or reshuffle its continuity, until these universe-altering crises became a strange recurring ritual all their own, a periodic thunderstorm that would sweep through and rearrange the furniture of reality. Readers came to know the rhythm of it, the way the whole universe would occasionally convulse and remake itself. Heroes dying and returning, histories rewritten, the very rules of existence renegotiated in one grand event after another. One of the most consequential of these came in more recent years, when a single grief-stricken speedster, unable to bear the murder of his mother long ago, ran back through time to save her, and in doing so shattered and rewrote the entire timeline, creating a darker, broken world, and then, in setting it right, accidentally birthing a wholesale reboot of the universe. Everything was renumbered and restarted. Histories were altered, costumes and origins were changed, and the whole line began again from the beginning. A controversial upheaval that thrilled some readers and dismayed others. It is a striking idea, when you sit with it, that the universe could be remade not by a cosmic god or an exploding star, but by a single good man's entirely understandable wish to save his mother, love itself becoming the force that unmakes and rewrites reality. In time, even that reboot was softened and partly undone, the lost history quietly restored in a warmer, more reconciliatory event that sought to bring back what readers had missed and to stitch the beloved old continuity together with the new, a gentle correction to an upheaval that had cut too deep. And through all of these convulsions, the multiverse itself, once so ruthlessly destroyed, crept steadily back into existence, until the company embraced it once more, settling on a tidy number of parallel worlds, a manageable constellation of alternate Earths where the wildest what-if stories could once again be told. The whole long history of destroying and rebuilding the multiverse became, in the end, a kind of eternal tide, sweeping out and rushing back, and the company made a strange sort of peace with the fact that its own infinite creativity could never be permanently contained. There is something almost philosophical in that endless cycle of destruction and renewal. In a fictional universe that periodically dies and is reborn, that cannot stop generating more history than it can hold, and cannot stop trying to tame it. It speaks to the peculiar nature of these shared, decades-long stories, which are never really finished and never really allowed to end, which must go on and on, absorbing every new writer's ideas, until they grow so heavy with their own past that they must occasionally be lightened by fire. And it speaks, too, to a kind of immortality. For in a universe that can always be rebooted, no hero is ever truly gone for good, no story ever truly final. Every ending merely a pause before the whole grand machine turns over once more and begins, hopefully and untiringly, again. Not all of the company's finest work was done in bright capes, and in the 1980s, a wave of gifted writers from across the ocean arrived and quietly transformed what a comic could be. One of them took a minor, half-forgotten swamp monster from the horror titles and turned it into something extraordinary, revealing in a single now famous twist that the creature was not, as everyone had believed, a man transformed into a plant, but a plant that had absorbed a dying man's memories and only dreamed that it had once been human, a shambling thing grieving for a life it had never actually lived. That reinvention, literate and strange and genuinely moving, showed that these characters could carry real weight, real horror, real philosophy, and it opened a door to a whole new kind of comic. Out of that same swamp emerged one of the company's most enduring and beloved figures, a scruffy, chain-smoking, working-class English occultist in a rumpled trench coat, a con man and a magician who tricks demons and cheats death and always outlives the friends who trust him. He was so vivid a creation that he was quickly given his own long-running series, a dark and mordant book of horror and hard luck that ran for decades, and he became the flagship of a new imprint the company created especially for its more mature and experimental work, a line aimed squarely at adult readers and freed from the old censorship code, where writers could explore darkness and sorrow and strangeness that the caped titles never could. The crown jewel of that mature imprint was a series about the Lord of Dreams, one of a family of 7 ancient, immensely powerful beings who are not gods but something older and stranger, the personifications of the deepest facts of existence, of dreaming and destiny and desire and despair, and most beloved of all, of death herself, imagined not as a grim reaper, but as a warm, kind, cheerful young woman who comes gently for everyone at the end. That series wove together mythology and history and literature into something that read less like a superhero comic than like a great dark fairy tale for adults, and it drew countless readers to comics who had never picked one up before, and it remains one of the most acclaimed works the medium has ever produced. There is a lovely piece of history attached to that Dream series. For one of its individual issues, a quiet, beautiful tale involving an old playwright and a company of fairies watching their own story performed, won a prestigious literary fantasy award, the first and only time a single comic book ever did so, and the startled organizers reportedly changed their rules afterward to prevent it from happening again, unsure what to do with a comic that had wandered into the company of proper novels. It is a small, telling anecdote about a moment when the medium quietly proved it could stand beside any other form of literature, and about a world of letters not quite ready to admit it. The mature imprint went on to publish a whole shelf of remarkable and influential works, dark and literary, and utterly unlike the Caped Adventures, tales of a preacher on a violent road trip searching for a god who has abandoned his creation, of fairy tale characters driven from their homelands and living in secret exile in the modern city, of the last surviving man on an earth where every other male creature has suddenly died. These were comics for grown readers, ambitious and strange and often heartbreaking, and many of them went on to become celebrated television shows and films decades later, quietly proving that the company's genius was never confined to heroes and villains, that beneath the bright surface there had always been a deeper, darker, more literary current running. The middle of the 1980s was, in fact, a kind of miracle year for the company, producing within a very short span 2 or 3 works that would permanently change how the whole world thought about comics. The first was a dense, brilliant, deeply pessimistic story set in an alternate version of the modern day, imagining what costumed heroes would really be like if they existed in the real world, damaged and frightening and all too human, and asking, in its famous recurring question, who would watch and restrain the watchmen themselves? It was so intricately constructed, so layered with symbol and structure, that it rewarded endless rereading, and it became the only comic book ever to win one of science fiction's most prestigious literary awards, and was later named by a major magazine as one of the finest novels of its century in any form. Close beside it came a story that reimagined the aging caped detective as a grizzled old man dragged out of retirement into a dark and violent future, a grim, muscular, furious vision that stripped away every trace of the campy lightness the character had once carried and reasserted him as a creature of genuine menace. Between them, these 2 works ushered in an era that came to be called the Grim and Gritty Age, a long fashion for darkness and moral complexity and violence that swept through the whole industry as creators everywhere rushed to make their heroes more troubled and more brutal. It was a revolution, and like many revolutions, it eventually curdled into excess, but at its best, it proved that these characters could bear the full weight of serious, adult storytelling. Not all the landmark stories were dark, and some of the most beloved reached in the opposite direction, back toward hope and wonder and the essential goodness of the heroes. There is a gorgeous, painted epic, imagining the heroes grown old and the world turned against them, a meditation on power and responsibility, and the fear that the old ideals might be passing away, shot through, in the end, with a hard-won faith in what the heroes stand for. There is a luminous, gentle series that distilled the caped strongman down to his purest essence, imagining his final days as he calmly sets his affairs in order while dying, performing one last series of impossible labors, a story so warm and so wise that many hold it up as the finest ever told about the character, a reminder that the oldest and simplest of the heroes could still break your heart. These landmark works share a quiet lesson that runs against the grain of the grim and gritty age they helped begin, which is that the very best stories about these characters are almost never really about the fighting at all, but about the ideas underneath, about power and its temptations, about grief and hope and duty, about what it means to be good in a world that makes goodness hard. The costumes and the powers are only the surface. Beneath them, the finest of these stories are asking the oldest and deepest human questions, and it is that, more than any spectacle, that has let the medium grow from disposable children's entertainment into something capable, at its heights, of standing with any other form of storytelling. There is a whole further tradition of great universe-spanning epics that the company became especially known for, sprawling events that gather the entire pantheon together to face some cosmic threat. And among the most beloved of these was a saga built around an emotional spectrum of colored lights, in which the green will of the ring-bearers was set against a rainbow of other powers, each drawn from a different feeling: rage and fear and hope and love and avarice and compassion, culminating in a war against death itself as the universe's fallen heroes rose from their graves. It was comic book storytelling at its most gloriously operatic, vast and colorful and unashamed, and it captured something the company has always done better than anyone: the grand cosmic epic in which the fate of all reality hangs in the balance, and the whole shining pantheon must stand together against the dark. Behind every one of these heroes and villains and cosmic sagas stand the real human beings who dreamed them up, and their stories are woven all through the history of the company, some triumphant and many bittersweet. We have already touched the deepest sorrow of all: the two young men who sold the caped strongman for a pittance and spent much of their lives shut out of the fortune he made. But their tale did eventually bend, late and imperfectly, toward justice. In the years around the great film that finally brought their hero to the big screen, as public attention turned to their plight and other creators rallied to their cause, the company that owned their creation agreed at last to grant them a pension and, just as importantly, to restore their names to every telling of the story, so that to this day, the words announcing that the hero was created by the two of them appear on nearly everything he touches. It was recognition arriving decades too late, but it was recognition, and it mattered. The same slow, belated justice eventually reached the quiet writer who had done so much to build the Caped Detective and gone uncredited for the better part of a century, his name finally added, long after his death, through the patient efforts of researchers and of his own descendant. These twin stories of the strongman's creators and the detectives have become a kind of conscience for the whole industry, cautionary tales about how easily the people who make these beloved things can be written out of them, and rallying points for the long, ongoing effort to treat creators more fairly, to make sure that the dreamers share in the dreams they build. Not all the creator stories are sad ones, and the history glows with figures whose imaginations shaped whole eras. There was the science fiction-loving editor who almost single-handedly engineered the return of the superhero and the birth of the Silver Age, reinventing the old heroes for a new generation. There was the restless artist of boundless imagination who poured out cosmic gods and grand mythologies at a furious pace. There were the writer and artist who, at the turn of the 1970s, dragged the Caped Detective back into the darkness and sent a pair of heroes on a hard-traveling journey through the real troubles of the world, tackling subjects the comics had never dared touch and proving the medium could speak to genuine social pain. Then came the great wave of writers from across the ocean who arrived in the 1980s and reinvented the possibilities of the form, the ones who gave the world the grieving swamp creature, and the trench-coated occultist, and the Lord of Dreams, and the terrible watchman, literate and ambitious and unafraid, who treated comics as a serious art and dared everyone else to do the same. And there were the great artists whose pencils defined how these characters look in the collective imagination, and the modern architects who, in more recent decades, lovingly restored the older, brighter heroes after the long, grim years, digging back into forgotten history to make the whole vast mythology feel whole and hopeful again. What all these creators share across the generations is that they were building something none of them could finish, adding their piece and passing it on, so that these characters are really the collective work of hundreds and hundreds of imaginations layered over 90 years. A genuinely collaborative mythology with no single author. Almost everything we think of as essential arrived gradually. One creator's idea building on another's. A villain here and a power there and a whole cosmology somewhere else. Until the accumulated dreaming of all those hands became the towering thing we know. There is something quietly moving in that. In a mythology built not by one genius but by a long relay of them, each carrying the torch a little further before handing it, still burning, to the next. If there is one idea that belongs to this company more than any other, one theme it has explored more richly than its great rival, it is the idea of legacy, of heroism as something passed down from one generation to the next, like a torch handed on in the dark. Because its heroes are so old, older than almost any others, the company found itself with generations of them, and it made that depth into a virtue, telling stories in which the sidekick grows up to become a hero in his own right, in which a fallen champion's name and mission are taken up by a successor, in which the mantle matters more than any single person who wears it. The very first boy sidekick grew up and stepped out of his mentor's shadow to become a respected hero under his own new name, and that pattern of growth and inheritance became one of the universe's deepest and most beloved recurring shapes. The greatest example of all may be the speedster's own young partner, a boy who idolized the Scarlet Hero and was granted the same powers, and who, when the older man died saving the universe in one of the great cosmic crises, took up his uncle's name and legacy and became the fastest man alive himself, no longer a sidekick, but the genuine successor, carrying the mission forward. His long journey from eager boy to grieving heir to a hero fully grown is one of the most satisfying arcs the medium has ever told, and it captures the beauty of the whole legacy idea, the sense that the heroes are not immortal individuals, but a relay of ordinary people, each choosing, in their turn, to pick up the burden and run. The young heroes were gathered, inevitably, into teams of their own, the most beloved of which brought together the sidekicks and teenage protégés of the great champions into a family of their own, a group of young heroes who grew up together, fell in love, quarreled, lost friends, and became, for a whole generation of readers, more real and more beloved than even the senior heroes they had once served under. Their stories were about friendship and growing up as much as about fighting villains, and the bonds between them, forged over years of shared adventure, gave the universe some of its warmest and most human relationships, proof that these tales could be about connection and belonging as much as about power. The legacy idea gave the universe a quiet emotional depth that pure invention could never match, for it meant that its heroes carried history on their shoulders, that a young champion might be haunted or inspired by the one whose name he had taken, that a costume might hold the memory of everyone who had ever worn it. It meant that death, in this universe, need not be the end of a hero so much as the beginning of a successor, that the mission could outlive any single person who served it, and there is something genuinely comforting in that vision, the idea that goodness is a torch rather than a candle, that it can be passed from hand to hand and go on burning long after any one bearer is gone. It also meant that the universe could grow old alongside its readers in a way few fictional worlds ever have, the sidekicks aging into heroes and taking on sidekicks of their own, whole family trees of heroism branching down the decades, grandparents and parents and children all wearing versions of the same symbols. That sense of a living generational history, of a universe with genuine depth of time, of heroes who remember their own long pasts and mentor their own successors, is one of the most distinctive and precious things the company ever built, and it is a large part of why its most devoted readers speak of its universe not as a product they consume, but as a place they have grown up in and grown old in and never quite left. Running alongside the bright world of the caped champions, and every bit as old, there has always been a shadowed, magical, uncanny side to the universe, a realm of ghosts and demons and ancient sorcerers where the ordinary rules of heroism do not apply. At its darkest edge stands a figure of genuine terror, a murdered man bound to a vast and pitiless spirit of divine vengeance, who wanders the world dispensing supernatural punishment on the wicked in ways that are often nightmarish to behold. A hero in only the loosest sense, closer to a force of cosmic justice, wearing a human ghost like a glove. He is one of the most powerful beings in the whole universe, and one of the most frightening, and his stories drift far from anything the bright heroes would recognize, into the territory of judgment and damnation, and the terrible weight of a wrath that cannot be reasoned with. The magical corner holds gentler ghosts too, like the spirit of a murdered circus acrobat who lingers on after death, unseen by the living, able to slip into and briefly wear the bodies of others, using that strange gift to help the desperate and to hunt, across the years, for the truth of his own killing. There is a poignancy to his existence, a dead man denied his rest, moving invisibly through a world that can no longer see him, doing quiet good that no one will ever thank him for, and he is one of the more melancholy and beautiful figures in the whole mythology, a reminder that the universe's darker corners often hold its most tender stories. There is a rhyming demon bound unwillingly to a mortal man, the two of them sharing a single existence across the centuries, the demon speaking always in verse. There are ancient helmeted sorcerers who serve the powers of cosmic order. There is a mysterious cloaked wanderer who appears at the edges of countless stories, offering cryptic help and never quite explaining himself. And there are the haunted anthology titles, the houses of mystery and of secrets, hosted by strange and sinister narrators, where for decades the company told its eerie short tales of ghosts and curses and twist endings, a whole tradition of quiet horror running beneath the superheroics, keeping alive the frightening spirit that the censorship code had once tried to stamp out. In time, the company gathered its magical heroes, as it gathered everyone, into a team of their own, a darker league devoted to the supernatural threats too strange and too terrible for the ordinary champions to face, the occult detectives and sorceresses and reformed monsters banding together against the horrors that lurk beneath reality. It is a lovely acknowledgement of how rich that shadowed side of the universe had grown, that it needed its own team, its own corner of the shared world, where the trench-coated conman and the backward-speaking sorceress and the swamp creature and the rhyming demon could stand together against the dark. The universe was never only about strength and speed and flight. It always had room for magic and mystery and the things that go bump in the endless comic book night. That magical undercurrent gives the whole universe a texture that pure science fiction never could, a sense that behind the gleaming cities and the cosmic empires there are older and stranger powers stirring, that the bright heroes are only one part of a much vaster and more mysterious reality. It means the universe can hold both a man who flies faster than light and a demon who speaks in rhyme, both a war between planets and a haunted house at the end of a country lane, and that breadth, that willingness to contain multitudes, to be at once a science fiction epic and a gothic ghost story and a fairy tale and a superhero adventure, is one of the deep secrets of why the universe has stayed alive and fascinating for so very long. One of the quiet pleasures of the universe is its geography, for unlike its great rival, which set most of its heroes in a single real city, this company scattered its champions across a whole invented map of fictional cities, each with its own character and its own mood, and drifting through them is a soothing thing. The caped strongman guards a gleaming, optimistic metropolis of light and glass and towering skyscrapers, a city of the bright future, all hope and progress, while the caped detective prowls a dark, gothic, rain-soaked city of gargoyles and corruption, a city of the fearful night. The two are often said to be two halves of a single real city, the shining daydream version and the shadowed nightmare version, one imagined as that city by day and the other as the very same city after dark. And there is a lovely poetry in that, the same place split into hope and fear and given to two very different heroes to protect. The map spreads out from there into a whole constellation of invented places, each the home of a different hero, a city of the speedster and a city of the archer, and a coastal city guarded by the man of the green ring, along with hidden and fantastical realms far stranger than any city, a paradise island of immortal warrior women, veiled from the world of men, an ancient kingdom sunk beneath the waves and lit by strange glowing coral, a planet of fire ruled by a tyrant god, a shining world of new deities. The universe built itself a genuine geography, a place you could map and travel through in your imagination, and for devoted readers, those invented cities became almost as real as any on an atlas, places with their own skylines and their own weather and their own long histories. There is something comforting in the sheer solidity of that invented world, in the way it hangs together as a single shared place where all these heroes live at once, where the strongman might fly over from his bright city to visit the detective in his dark one, where a crisis in the ancient sea kingdom might draw champions from a dozen different cities to help. It is a whole coherent cosmos, built up detail by detail over 90 years until it has the density and the texture of a real place. And part of the deep pleasure of it is simply that it is so large and so consistent, a vast imagined world you can wander through endlessly and never quite reach the edge of. The universe reaches far beyond its Earth too, out into a richly imagined cosmos full of alien worlds and empires and civilizations, a whole populated galaxy patrolled by the intergalactic police force of the Ring-Bearers, home to warlike alien races and peaceful ones, to distant planets each with their own strange cultures, to the burning world of the tyrant god and the shining world of the new deities. The scale of it is genuinely vast, stretching from the smallest hidden world within an atom to the farthest reaches of space and the highest realms of gods, and it is all, somehow, a single connected place, one enormous shared reality in which a story can be told at any scale at all, from a quiet night on a city rooftop to a war for the fate of all creation. And threaded through that whole vast geography is the deep, unspoken promise that gives it its warmth, the sense that no matter how dark the city or how distant the world, somewhere nearby there is a hero watching over it, that the shining metropolis and the Gothic city and the sunken kingdom and the far alien planet are all, each of them, someone's to protect. It is a comforting vision of a cosmos, an entire universe with a guardian for every corner of it, and there is something genuinely restful in drifting through that imagined map at the end of a long day, city by invented city, each one dark and quiet now, and each one watched over, all of it safe and still and waiting for morning. Almost from the beginning, these characters were too large to stay on the page, and they spilled out into every medium the century could offer, starting with the radio, where the caped strongman found an enormous audience in the 1940s. That radio show did more than entertain. In one genuinely remarkable storyline, it turned its hero against a real and hateful secret society that was troubling the country at the time, working with a brave man who had infiltrated the group and passing its guarded secrets and silly passwords out over the public airwaves, holding the whole sinister organization up to national ridicule. It is a genuinely inspiring piece of history, a fictional hero doing real good in the actual world, helping to strip the menace from a group that traded on fear and mystery, and it remains one of the proudest moments in the character's long life. The early animated cartoons made of the strongman around the same time were lavish and beautiful, some of the most expensive and gorgeously produced animation of their day, and they left one permanent mark on the character that endures to this moment. For in the comics he had until then mostly leaped rather than flown, but the animators found that all that leaping looked awkward and jerky in motion, and asked whether he might simply be allowed to fly properly, gliding smoothly through the air, and the company agreed. That small practical decision, made to solve an animator's problem, settled the question forever, and true flight, born on a movie screen, flew back into the comics and became one of the character's defining powers, so that he has soared ever since because a cartoonist once found jumping too hard to draw. The heroes moved on into film serials and then into television, where a generation came to know the strongman through a friendly, reassuring show in the 1950s, and where, a little later, the caped detective was reborn as a bright and campy figure of pure fun that defined him for millions. But the great leap came at the very end of the 1970s, when the strongman was given a big, lavish, serious film with a promise right there in its advertising that audiences would believe a man could fly, and a young actor in the title role gave a performance so warm and so sincere, so perfectly balanced between the shy reporter and the noble hero, that for countless people he simply became the character, the definitive human face of a drawing that had existed for 40 years. That film proved these characters could carry grand, emotional, big-budget cinema, and it opened the door to everything that followed. The Amazon Princess, too, found her definitive early form on the television screen in those same years, in a beloved series whose star embodied the character's warmth and strength and grace so completely that she, like the flying actor, became for a whole generation the living image of a hero who had until then lived only in ink. There is a pattern in all of this worth noticing, the way these paper characters seem to need a human face to complete them, the way a single perfect performance can fuse with a drawing until the two become inseparable in the public mind, so that we can no longer quite picture the hero without also picturing the person who once brought them to life. The characters belong to everyone, but every so often a performer lends them their own face for a while, and the loan somehow becomes permanent. Through all these early adventures in radio and film and television runs the quiet truth that these characters were always collaborative and always migrating, never content to stay in one medium, picking up new pieces of themselves everywhere they went. The flight from the cartoons, and the weakness from the radio, and the human faces from the films, all of it flowing back into the ever-growing legend. They were never really just comics, from almost the very start. They were a mythology loose in the culture, appearing wherever there were stories to be told, and each new form added something that the others kept, until the characters became these vast composite things, built out of ink and sound and light and film, belonging fully to no single medium and living, somehow, in all of them at once. For many people who grew up in the last few decades, though, the truest version of these heroes lived not in comics or films but in animation, in a run of extraordinary cartoons that began in the early 1990s with a moody, beautiful film noir take on the Caped detective and grew, over the following years, into a whole connected animated universe. That universe went on to give the same loving, serious treatment to the Caped strongman and then to the entire assembled League of Heroes, building over more than a decade into one of the most beloved and acclaimed bodies of superhero storytelling ever produced in any medium, admired even by many who find the comics themselves impenetrable. For a whole generation, the voices and the faces of that animated universe simply are the characters, the definitive versions against which all others are quietly measured. That animated tradition gave the world some of the most enduring performances the characters have ever received. Voices that became as iconic as any live-action face. A calm, deep voice for the detective that defined him for 30 years, and a wild, cackling voice for his greatest enemy that became the very sound of the clown in millions of imaginations. When the performer who had voiced the detective for so long passed away a few years ago, the grief was genuine and widespread, a whole generation mourning a voice that had been part of the furniture of their childhoods, a reminder that these characters are carried into the world by real and mortal people whom we come, over the years, quietly to love. The heroes conquered the world of video games as well, and after a long history of disappointing efforts, a single game arrived, built around the caped detective that finally captured what it might feel like to be him, to stalk through the dark and strike from the shadows and unravel a mystery, and it and its sequels became some of the most acclaimed games ever made, drawing once again on those same beloved animated voices. Others followed, fighting games that pitted the whole pantheon against one another in stories of their own, sprawling adventures that let players step directly into the shining cities and the cosmic wars, so that the characters came alive in yet another medium, one where you did not merely watch the heroes, but briefly became them. In more recent years, the heroes have filled the screens more thoroughly than ever, in a sprawling web of interconnected television shows that gathered the lesser-known champions, the speedster and the archer and the rest, into a shared universe of their own beloved by devoted fans, and in a series of big-budget films that gathered the great pantheon together with enormous ambition and decidedly mixed fortunes. The company's history on the modern big screen has been a turbulent one, marked by soaring successes and painful stumbles, by grand visions and false starts and frequent reinventions, an ongoing struggle to translate the vastness of the comic universe into film, and it continues to be rewritten even now, the characters endlessly recast and reimagined for each new age and each new audience. What all of it shows, the cartoons and the games and the shows and the films, is that these characters have long since escaped the printed page entirely and become something closer to folklore, common property of the whole culture, known and loved by countless people who have never read a single comic. A child today can recognize the strongman's crest and the detective's cowl and the Amazon's tiara without ever having held an actual comic book, can know the heroes through screens alone, and there is something both a little sad and rather wonderful in that, the way the mythology has outgrown its own origins, floating free of the medium that made it, alive now in the shared imagination of the entire world. No history of this company would be complete without its great rival, the other of the two enormous houses that have divided the superhero world between them for generations, and the long, strange, mostly friendly competition between them. The rival, which rose to prominence a couple of decades later, with a different sensibility, is said to have taken to referring to this older company with a mix of respect and mischief as the Distinguished Competition, a wry nickname that stuck. Where the older company built gods and legends, bright archetypes towering above humanity, the younger one built flawed, human, neurotic heroes who worried about the rent and squabbled among themselves, and the contrast between the two visions, the mythic and the human, has shaped and enriched the whole medium, each pushing the other to be better. For all their rivalry, the two houses have, on rare and special occasions, set their competition aside and let their characters meet in intercompany crossovers that felt, to fans, like genuine miracles, impossible summit meetings between heroes who could never normally share a page. The very first great one, decades ago, brought the older company's caped strongman together with the younger one's famous wall crawler in an oversized special that delighted everyone, and others followed over the years, whole teams crossing the divide to fight alongside or against one another. There was even, at one strange and wonderful moment, a project that merged the two universes' characters together into single combined heroes, blending a champion from each company into one, a playful acknowledgement of how deeply the two mythologies had come to mirror and complete each other. There is a genuinely surprising piece of history in just how closely the two great rivals cooperated behind the scenes, for despite competing fiercely on the newsstands, they jointly held, for many decades, a shared legal claim to the very term for a costumed champion, the two of them together owning the trademark on the phrase and defending it side by side against anyone else who tried to use it commercially. It is a delicious little fact, the two great rivals quietly holding hands beneath the table to keep the words that describe their entire genre for themselves, and the arrangement endured for a remarkably long time before it was finally challenged and let go, the term at last set free for everyone to use. The rivalry between the two houses has been, on balance, one of the healthiest things in the whole medium, a decades-long creative contest that drove both to keep inventing, keep improving, keep reaching for new kinds of stories. Fans have argued the merits of the two forever, in a good-natured war that has itself become part of the fun, some drawn to the older company's grand mythic heroes and their sense of hope and legend, others to the younger company's grounded, human, troubled champions. And the truth is that the medium is immeasurably richer for having both, for the conversation between the godlike and the human that the two great houses have carried on across the better part of a century. And beneath the competition there has always been a kind of kinship, for the people who make these comics have often moved between the two companies over their careers, carrying ideas and techniques back and forth, and the characters themselves, for all their differences, share the same deep roots and the same essential purpose, to give us heroes to look up to and dream alongside. The two great universes are, in the end, less like enemies than like siblings, born of the same moment and the same medium, grown up in competition, but bound by a common inheritance. And the long story of their rivalry is really the story of two different, beautiful answers to the same simple question, which is what a hero might be, and what, in our better dreams, we might hope to become. There is a whole scattering of smaller facts and records and curiosities that do not fit tidily anywhere else, and they make for gentle company as the night deepens. That very first comic featuring the caped strongman, printed cheaply for a dime and meant to be read and thrown away, has become the single most valuable comic book in existence, the finest surviving copies changing hands for millions upon millions of dollars, more than almost anyone in 1938 could have dreamed a thin little pamphlet could ever be worth. The two anthology titles from which the company grew, the detective one and the action one, have run for so many decades and so many hundreds of issues that they are among the longest continuously published comics in the entire history of the medium. Unbroken chains of storytelling, stretching back most of a century. The company's little logo, the round emblem it stamps on the corner of its covers, has been redesigned many times over the years, and longtime readers can very nearly date a comic simply by which version of that small badge sits in its corner, a quiet visual history of the whole enterprise, told in a series of tiny evolving symbols. The hero's own emblems have their own stories too. The strongman's chest crest reimagined in later years as an alien symbol meaning hope in the language of his lost world, a lovely retroactive touch that turned a simple letter into something mythic, so that the most famous symbol in all of superherodom came to stand, quite literally, for hope itself. The company's reach has always extended, curiously, beyond superheroes and even beyond comics as we usually think of them, for its corporate family has at various times included all manner of other things, from a legendary humor magazine that skewered the whole culture, to licensed adventures of characters borrowed from film and television. Its heroes have been made into every kind of merchandise imaginable, have lent their symbols to lunchboxes and bedsheets and cereal boxes for generations, have become so woven into the fabric of ordinary life that their emblems are recognized instantly almost everywhere on Earth, understood without a word in nearly every country and language, a handful of simple shapes that carry meaning across the whole world. There are countless smaller wonders tucked into the long history, oddities that reward a curious and drifting mind. There are the imaginary tales the company loved to tell, stories set outside the official continuity that ask what might have happened if a hero had landed somewhere else, or lived in another age, or made a different choice, free to break every rule precisely because they did not truly count. There are the beloved animal characters and the fifth-dimensional imps, and the whole menagerie of strange and delightful oddities the more playful eras produced. There are the letters columns where readers argued and dreamed, the fan clubs, the conventions, the whole living culture that grew up around these paper heroes and became, for many people, a genuine and lasting home. And there is the simple, staggering scale of it all to marvel at as you drift. The sheer number of stories, tens of thousands upon tens of thousands of individual comics published across 90 years and more. An ocean of storytelling so vast that no single person could ever read all of it in a lifetime. A continuous act of collective imagination, sustained without interruption for the better part of a century. It is one of the largest and longest-running works of fiction ever created by human beings. This shared universe, built by thousands of hands and read by hundreds of millions of eyes, still growing, still unfinished, still adding new pages every single month. A great endless story that was being written before you were born and will go on being written long after tonight has faded into morning. One of the deepest pleasures the company ever offered its readers grew directly out of that old idea of the multiverse and the imaginary tale, and it is the freedom to take a beloved hero and drop him into an entirely different world and see what he becomes. Freed from the demands of ongoing continuity, writers could ask the wildest questions, and the company made a whole tradition of publishing such stories under a banner that marked them as tales of other worlds, other histories, other lives. What if the little rocket carrying the infant strongman had come down not in the fields of the American heartland, but on the far side of the world, so that the great symbol of one nation's ideals grew up instead as the champion of its rival, the same powers and the same kindness, bent toward an utterly different vision of how to save the world. What if the Caped detective had prowled his Gothic city, not in the modern age but 100 years earlier, in the era of gaslight and fog and hansom cabs, hunting a real and infamous killer through the smoke of a Victorian night? What if the heroes had aged and the world had turned against them? Or if they had never existed at all? Or if a single terrible loss had turned the gentlest of them into a tyrant who decided to rule the world for its own good rather than merely protect it? Each of these questions became a story, a self-contained window into a world that might have been, and together they form a fascinating shadow library alongside the main one, a whole shelf of the roads not taken. There is something genuinely thrilling in these alternate tales, because they reveal, by contrast, what is truly essential about each hero, what survives when everything else is changed. Move the strong man to the other side of the world, and he is still, at his core, someone trying to help. Age the detective by decades, and he is still, at his core, someone who will not stop. And in seeing what remains constant across all these different worlds, you come to understand the characters more deeply than any single story could teach you. The alternate tales are a kind of experiment, a way of asking what a hero really is, by testing him against every possible circumstance, and the answers are often quietly moving. These imagined worlds also gave the company a place to tell darker and stranger and more final stories than the ongoing books ever could, tales that could kill their heroes for good, or let them win completely, or follow them all the way to the end of their lives, precisely because they stood outside the official history and did not have to leave everything as they found it. A hero in the main continuity can never truly die and never truly finish, must always be left ready for the next writer and the next month. But a hero in one of these separate worlds can be given a real ending, a genuine conclusion, and there is a particular power in that, in stories that are allowed, for once, to actually end. And in a lovely turn, many of these once separate imaginary worlds were eventually folded back into the reborn multiverse, granted their own numbered Earths, made real corners of the larger reality rather than mere hypotheticals, so that the Soviet strongman and the Victorian detective and the aged, embittered heroes all became genuine places on the great map of the infinite. It is a fitting fate for them, and a very characteristic one for this company, whose whole history is a story of imagination refusing to be contained, of every wild what-if eventually finding a home, of a universe so generous and so vast that in the end it makes room for all its own dreams, even the ones it once set carefully to one side. Among the most astonishing things the company ever did was to kill its own flagship hero, the invulnerable caped strongman himself, in an event that became genuine national news and drew in countless people who had never read a comic in their lives. The story pitted him against a monstrous, mindless engine of destruction, a grey behemoth that clawed its way up from underground and rampaged across the country, leaving ruin in its wake. Unstoppable and unreasoning, and the two of them simply beat each other to death in the streets of the hero's own gleaming city, trading blows until both finally fell. That the most powerful and most enduring hero in the world could die at all was a shock that rippled far beyond the comic shops, and the issue that told it sold in staggering numbers, its black-bordered cover a small tombstone for a paper god. There is a piece of behind-the-scenes history that makes the whole thing even more remarkable, for the death came about partly by accident of circumstance, the writers having originally planned a great wedding for the hero that had to be postponed for reasons of timing with a television show, leaving them casting about for something enormous to do instead, and settling, almost in desperation, on killing him. What followed the death was nearly as strange. A long stretch in which the world believed him gone, and 4 mysterious figures appeared, each claiming in some way to be his successor or his return. A cyborg and an armored man, and a visored stranger and a young clone, before at last the true hero, never truly dead, returned to life and reclaimed his place. The whole saga became one of the best-selling and most talked-about stories in the history of the medium. What made the death resonate, beneath all the spectacle and the sales, was the way it let the world grieve him, the way it showed an entire fictional planet mourning the loss of its greatest protector, the funeral processions, and the weeping crowds, and the sense of a light gone out of the world. It reminded everyone, by taking him away, of exactly what he had always meant, and his return, when it came, felt genuinely earned, a resurrection that carried real emotional weight, precisely because the loss had been allowed to feel real first. It is a strange and powerful thing a story can do, to kill a hero everyone knows cannot truly stay dead, and still make his death and his return mean something. And the company did it about as well as it has ever been done. Not everything in the universe is so weighty though, and it would be a shame to drift past its lighter, sillier wonders, the delightful oddities that the more whimsical eras produced, and that long-time readers cherish precisely for their strangeness. There is a cracked, chalk-white, imperfect duplicate of the caped strongman, a flawed copy who does everything backwards and lives on a cube-shaped world where ugliness is prized and up is down, and who speaks in a tangled, inverted logic all his own, a figure at once comical and oddly poignant, a broken mirror of the perfect hero. There is a mischievous little imp from another dimension who pops into reality to torment the strongman for his own amusement with reality-bending pranks, and who can only be banished back home by tricking him into saying his own jumble of a name backwards, a wonderfully absurd weakness for so powerful a nuisance. And there are the super-powered animals, the whole charming menagerie of them, a caped dog from the hero's own lost world who flies and shares his powers, along with a super cat and a super horse and a super monkey, and even the caped detective's own masked hound, gathered in the far future into a loyal little league of super pets all their own. There is the shrunken Bottle City, a last surviving fragment of the hero's dead homeworld, its tiny inhabitants preserved alive in miniature and kept safe in his Arctic sanctuary, a whole living civilization the size of a bottle, waiting patiently to one day be restored. These are the gentle absurdities of the universe, the flying dogs and the backwards imps and the cities in bottles, and there is something deeply soothing about them, a reminder that beneath all its cosmic weight, this great mythology has always kept a place for pure, warm, uncomplicated whimsy. It is worth pausing, as the night deepens, on the humble physical craft of how these comics are actually made, because it is stranger and more collaborative than most people realize. A single comic is rarely the work of one person, but of a small assembly line of specialists, a writer who scripts the story, a penciler who draws it in light grey lines, an inker who goes over those lines in permanent black to give them weight and depth, a colorist who fills it all with light and shade, and a letterer who adds the words and the balloons and the great booming sound effects, each craftsman handing the pages along to the next. That so seamless a thing as a comic page is really the layered work of many different hands, each an expert in one narrow art, is a quiet marvel, a kind of relay of creation repeated thousands of times a month. The physical object itself has changed shape many times across the decades, From the cheap, thin, stapled pamphlet sold on the spinning racks of drugstores and newsstands, meant to be read once and discarded, to the sturdier collected editions that gather many issues into a single book to be kept on a shelf and read again. The way people buy them changed too, drifting from the newsstands of old to a network of dedicated specialty shops, and then, in more recent years, onto screens, where whole libraries of comics can be carried in a pocket and read by the glow of a tablet in the dark. And somewhere along the way, the medium learned to call its more ambitious book-length works by a grander name, the graphic novel, a phrase that helped these stories find their way at last onto the shelves of ordinary bookshops and libraries, and into a new and wider respect. Through all these changes, the great engine kept turning, month after month, decade after decade, the company producing its steady stream of new adventures on relentless deadlines, a small army of writers and artists and editors laboring quietly behind the scenes to keep the whole vast universe moving forward. There is something quietly heroic in that unglamorous, unbroken labor, the sheer discipline of producing so many stories so reliably for so long, the letterers and colorists and inkers whose names most readers never learn, all of them keeping faith with the deadline and the reader, all of them adding their small, careful piece to the endless story before passing it along. And the art itself, the drawing, deserves a moment of its own, for these are above all a visual medium, and much of their magic lives in the pictures. The greatest artists of the form learn to do things no other medium can, to freeze a figure in mid-leap so that the whole page seems to move, to open onto a single enormous image that stops the breath, to guide the eye across a page in a hidden dance of panels and gutters and turning corners. The covers alone are an art unto themselves, small posters designed to catch the eye and promise wonder, and generations of artists poured their finest work into those single images, some of which have become as iconic as any painting, instantly recognizable even to people who never read the story behind them. The look of the heroes evolved constantly under all those different hands, growing more detailed or more stylized with the fashions of each age, the anatomy and the shadows, and the very way motion is drawn shifting from decade to decade, so that a practiced eye can often date a comic simply by the style of its art. And yet, through all that change, the essential images held firm. The crest and the cape and the cowl and the tiara, the great silhouettes that any child can recognize. Proof that beneath all the shifting styles, there is something permanent in these designs. A visual poetry so strong that it survives every reinterpretation, passed down like the characters themselves from one generation of artists to the next. No account of this universe would be complete without the people on the other side of the page, the readers, for these characters have never really belonged to the company that owns them so much as to the countless people who have loved them across the generations. From the very earliest days, there was a conversation between the creators and their audience, carried on in the letter columns printed at the back of the comics, where readers wrote in with their praise and their complaints and their wild theories, and the editors wrote back, and out of that back and forth grew the first stirrings of organized fandom, a community of people who cared about these stories enough to argue over them and to find one another. It was one of the earliest and warmest fan cultures of the modern age, and it has never stopped growing. That culture blossomed over the decades into something enormous and joyful, into great gatherings where tens of thousands of people come together to celebrate the characters they love, many of them dressed as their favorite heroes and villains, wearing the capes and the cowls and the tiaras with obvious delight, becoming for a weekend the figures they have admired all their lives. There is something genuinely moving in the sight of it, in grown adults and small children alike, lighting up at the shared symbols, in the way these paper characters can gather so many different people into a single warm community, giving strangers a common language and a common love, a reminder that the stories were never really about ink at all, but about connection. The deepest truth about the readers, though, is a quieter one, and it is the way these characters accompany people through the whole of their lives. Because the universe is so old and so continuous, it is entirely possible to grow up with it, to meet the heroes as a small child and follow them through youth and middle age and beyond, so that the stories become woven into the texture of a whole life, markers of its passing seasons. People remember where they were when a favorite hero died, or returned, or married. They associate certain stories with certain years of their own lives. They hand the comics they loved as children down to children of their own. The universe becomes, for its most devoted readers, less a thing they consume than a lifelong companion, a familiar country they can always return to. There is a particular comfort in that lifelong companionship, in having a set of stories that are always there, always being added to, always ready to be picked up again after years away, the characters unchanged in their essence, no matter how long you have been gone. In a life full of endings and losses and change, the great continuing universe offers a rare kind of constancy, a world that keeps on turning whether you are watching or not, its heroes still fighting the good fight, still standing watch, still exactly who they always were, ready to welcome you back the moment you open a book. For many people, that constancy is a genuine solace, a fixed and friendly star to steer by. And perhaps that is the truest measure of what these creators built, not the sales or the films or the fortunes, but the simple fact that they made something people could love for a lifetime and pass on to the next. A shared world large enough and warm enough and hopeful enough to grow old inside. The heroes were made to sell cheap comics to children in a vanished age, and they became, almost by accident, something far greater, a common inheritance, a modern folklore, a source of comfort and wonder for generation after generation. And there is no better note than that on which to let the whole long story settle, gently, toward its rest. One of the quieter and more hopeful threads in the universe's long history is the slow broadening of who is allowed to be a hero, the way the roster grew over the decades to reflect more and more of the wide world of people actually reading it. The earliest heroes were drawn almost entirely from a single narrow mold, but as the years passed, the universe made room for champions of every background, new bearers of old and famous mantles who brought new faces and new perspectives to them, so that the great symbols could belong to a wider circle. One of the corps of ring bearers gained a member who, through years of beloved animated adventures, became for many people the definitive version of that hero, and a young hero built partly of machine, once a member of the teenage team, was in time elevated to stand among the founding greats of the whole pantheon. The legacy idea we spoke of earlier turned out to be a gift here as well, for the tradition of passing a name and a mantle from one hero to the next made it natural for the universe to widen its circle, letting a familiar symbol be taken up by someone quite different from the one who first wore it, honoring the old hero while opening the role to new kinds of people. Over time, the universe filled with heroes drawn from communities that had rarely seen themselves in capes before. And while the road was uneven and often too slow, the direction was steady, the great shared world gradually stretching to hold more of the readers who loved it, so that more and more children could look up at the pantheon and find, somewhere in it, a hero who looked something like themselves. There is a real and gentle beauty in that widening, in the way a mythology born in one narrow moment kept growing outward toward everyone, kept discovering that its grand ideas of heroism and hope and courage were never meant to belong to only one kind of person, but to all of us, and that the symbols only grow stronger the more widely they are shared. It is an unfinished project, like the universe itself, always reaching and never quite arriving, but the reaching is one of the better things about it. The long, slow, stubborn effort to make the dream of the hero a dream with room enough for everyone inside it. At the very center of that whole vast pantheon, holding it together like three great pillars, stand the first three: the strongman and the detective and the Amazon, so central and so complementary that fans came to speak of them simply as the Trinity. Each embodies a different virtue and a different way of being a hero. The strongman all heart and hope and gentle power, the detective all mind and will and grim determination, the Amazon all compassion and truth and warrior's grace. And the universe returns again and again to the interplay among them, the way they balance and challenge and complete one another. The bright optimist and the dark pragmatist and the wise warrior, three answers to the same question, bound together by mutual respect and a shared devotion to the good. There is a lovely, oft-explored dynamic in the way the three of them relate. The strongman and the detective in particular, famously representing two opposite philosophies: faith in people set against preparation for the worst, hope against suspicion, the sunlight and the shadow, and yet each trusting the other with his life. The Amazon often stands between them, a bridge and a balance, tempering the strongman's idealism with clear-eyed strength and the detective's darkness with genuine warmth. Together the three form something greater than any of them alone, a kind of complete picture of heroism. And the universe has long understood that its truest heart lies not in any one of them, but in the space between the three, in their friendship and their differences and their shared, unshakable commitment to protecting the world. Beneath all the powers and the villains and the tangled continuities, what has truly kept these characters alive for the better part of a century is what they stand for, the simple, sturdy ideals stitched into the heart of each one, and it is worth dwelling on those as the night grows late. The ring-bearers of the green light speak an oath before they go out into the dark, a short verse promising that in the brightest day and the blackest night no evil shall escape their sight. And there is something genuinely stirring in the idea of a hero who must, quite literally, recite a promise of vigilance and courage before he can do his work, whose very power is drawn from his ability to overcome his own fear. The caped strongman stands, above all, for a kind of gentle, unwavering decency, for the idea that the most powerful being on earth might choose, freely and always, to be kind, to protect rather than to rule, to lift up rather than to dominate. It is easy to mistake him for bland, this endlessly good man, but the better stories understand that his goodness is the whole point and the hardest thing about him, that a being who could take anything he wanted and instead spends his life helping others is not boring but quietly radical, a daily argument that power and cruelty need not go together, that strength can serve gentleness. He is, in the end, a story we tell ourselves about the best we might be if we were given everything. The Amazon princess carries an ideal of compassion married to strength, the belief that fierceness and mercy are not opposites, that one can be a mighty warrior and still choose love and truth as the highest goods. The caped detective embodies the terrible power of a single human will refusing to surrender to grief and despair, the proof that an ordinary person, with no gifts but determination, can stand against the dark. and the whole assembled league of them together embodies the deepest idea of all, that we are stronger and better joined than alone, that the answer to a threatening world is not to hide but to stand together, shoulder to shoulder, and refuse to let the darkness win. These are not complicated ideas, but they are deep ones, and they are the real reason the characters endure. There is a reason these heroes have lasted so much longer than most of the stories of our age, and it is that they have become something close to a genuine modern mythology, a shared set of figures through which we think about power and justice and hope and grief, the way older ages thought through their gods and their legends. The strong man is our myth of the benevolent power, the detective our myth of the will that will not break, the Amazon our myth of compassionate strength, and like the old myths, they can be told and retold endlessly, reshaped for each new generation, never used up, because they are not really about the fights at all, but about the oldest questions of how to live and who to be. We return to them, again and again, because they are about us. And perhaps that is the gentlest note to rest on, the understanding that beneath all the spectacle these bright figures are, at bottom, a vast and hopeful dream that we have been dreaming together for 90 years, a shared vision of a world watched over by the good and the brave, of power turned to kindness and grief turned to protection, and ordinary people rising, when they must, to become something more. It is a comforting dream to carry down into sleep, the dream of the guardians who never rest so that others can, of the whole shining pantheon standing watch over a quiet world, asking nothing, wanting nothing, simply keeping the long and faithful vigil, while everyone they protect drifts safely off to sleep. There is nothing left to read tonight, no last page to turn, and no final panel waiting in the dark. You have wandered a long way already into the great paper mythology of it all, into the humble beginnings of the company and the first spark of the hero who started everything. And there is a great deal more still to drift gently through before the night is over. But there is no hurry now, and nothing you need to hold on to, and nothing at all that you must stay awake to hear. Let it all drift over you softly now, the strange visitor from a dying world, the woman shaped from clay on a hidden island, the man who runs faster than a thought, the green light of a ring held up against the black, the whole shining pantheon, rising and falling and rising again across the long years. Let them fade gently into the dark, one by one, like the last lights going quietly out over a great sleeping city, until nothing at all remains but the quiet and the warmth and the soft, slow sound of your own easy breathing. You do not have to remember any of it, and there is nothing here you need to carry with you. There is no page you must hold your place in, no story you are obliged to finish tonight. The whole enormous library of it will keep perfectly well until morning, every issue shelved and quiet, every hero and every villain at rest between the covers of a closed and darkened book. Let your breathing slow. Let the room grow warm and safe around you. There is nothing to solve and nothing to chase, and nowhere at all you need to be but here, sinking gently into sleep. Rest now. You have earned this quiet too. The long story will still be there in the morning, patient and unhurried, waiting to be taken up again whenever you wish. And there is nothing at all you need to do tonight, but let your thoughts go soft and your body grow heavy and your eyes fall closed. You have wandered a long way through the dark tonight, and you are allowed, now, to simply stop and rest. Good night, and sleep well.